my pleasure today to introduce our own Robert Brandom, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Pittsburgh in the Philosophy Department. He's author of many influential books and articles, most notably Making It Explicit. Today he'll be presenting his 2007 Woodbridge lectures, which he gave last November at Columbia University. The title of the lectures is The Animating Ideals of Idealism, a Semantic, Sonata, and Kant and Hegel. And today he'll be talking about norms, selves, and concepts. After the talk, there will be a reception and dinner in the William Pitt Union Lower Lounge, which, if you go right out the building here and walk up Bigelow, you'll get to it. There's a big sort of porch with a veranda. You'll see it. People will be going there. And so now, if we could all welcome Robert Brandom.
Well, thank you all for coming. In these lectures, I'm going to consider some of the ideas that animated the philosophical tradition that's anchored and epitomized by Kant and Hegel, that they called idealism. And my aim is to reanimate some of those ideas, to breathe new life into them, to exhibit them as worthy of our interest and attention today. I'm going to do that by retrospectively, rationally reconstructing a coherent, cumulative trajectory of thought, carving it out of the context in which it's embedded by ruthlessly ignoring elements that are near and dear to Kant and Hegel themselves, but which are not essential to the line of thought on which I'll be focusing. This will seem to some to be a perverse sort of enterprise. At the end of my third and final lecture, I'll assemble conceptual raw materials drawn from all three lectures in order to address the methodological issue of how to think about the nature, justification, and possible value of an enterprise of this sort. At the heart of Descartes' innovations in epistemology and the philosophy of mind lies a revolutionary semantic idea. He saw that the rising new science required giving up old ways of thinking about the relations between appearance and reality. Since the Greeks, the idea had been that, at least when things go well, the way things appear resembles the way they actually are. Resemblance in this sense is a matter of sharing properties, or some more general notion of form, as a realistic picture shares some elements of shape and perhaps color with what it pictures. But on Copernicus's account, the reality behind the appearance of a stationary Earth and a revolving sun is a rotating Earth and a stationary sun. No resemblance there. And Galileo's reading of what he called the Book of Nature, written in the language of mathematics, finds the best way of getting a grip on the reality of motion to be by manipulating geometrical appearances, in which, for instance, a period of time shows up as the length of a line, and acceleration as the area of a triangle. The category of resemblance is of little help in understanding the connections that are being exploited. And in Descartes' own algebraized geometry, the equations of lines and circles do not at all resemble the geometrical figures about which they let us reason so effectively. Descartes sees that a more abstract notion of representation is needed, and we've pretty much been worrying about it ever since. For Descartes, the way discursive algebraic equations represent geometrical figures serves as a paradigm of representational relations generally, and in particular of the relation between appearance and reality, between the concept manipulating mind and the geometrical Galilean world of extended things in motion that the mind thinks about by representing it. What makes it possible to use algebraic formulae to reason about geometrical objects, the phenomenon I'm claiming provided Descartes with his semantic paradigm, is the global isomorphism between the two systems. One can, if one likes, still think of a formula and the figure it represents as sharing something or being alike in some way. But what they share must be thought about in terms of the role that each plays in the system of which it's part, the structure-preserving ways in which a formulae's relation to other formulae can be mapped onto a figure's relation to other figures. Apart from those horizontal relations between representings and other representings, The vertical semantic relations between representings and representeds are invisible and unintelligible. This holistic character of the new notion of representation was not lost on Spinoza, for whom thought of the world is possible only because the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas, nor on Leibniz, who required each monad to represent its whole universe in order to represent any of it. Where Descartes' semantic concerns center on the nature of representational success, though, Kant addresses a more fundamental question about the nature of representational purport. What is it, he wants to know, for our ideas so much as to seem to be about something? What is it for us to take or treat them as, for them to show up to us as representings, in the sense of something that answers for its correctness to what thereby counts as being represented? The line of thought he develops to answer those questions begins with the identification of a critical shortcoming of the account of judgment that he had inherited. That account finds its place as part of the traditional classificatory theory of consciousness. This is the idea that to be aware of something is to take it as something, paradigmatically to classify something particular as being of some general kind. In its form as a theory of judgment, it becomes the view that judging is predicating one concept of another, putting two concepts into a relation marked by a copula, whose paradigm, once again, is bringing a particular concept under a general one, or subordinating a less general one to a more general one. In a radical break with the whole of the logical tradition he inherited, Kant rejects this way of thinking about judgment. The reason he gives is that it doesn't apply to logically compound judgments. He says, quote, "I've never been able to accept the interpretation which logicians give of judgment in general. It is, they declare, the representation of a relation between two concepts. What's defective in this interpretation is that it applies only to categorical, not to hypothetical and disjunctive judgments, the two latter containing a relation not of concepts but of judgments, an oversight from which many troublesome consequences have followed." End of the quote. It'll be instructive to follow out some of those troublesome consequences. The same logical tradition distinguishes between mental acts and their contents, that is, between the two sides of what Sellers calls the notorious ing-ed ambiguity, which affects concepts such as judgment, representation, experience, and perception. The distinction, namely, between what one is doing in judging, representing, experiencing, and perceiving on the one hand, and what's judged, represented, experienced, or perceived on the other. Sensitivity to that distinction should prompt the question whether understanding judgment as consisting in predication, or the relation of two concepts, is intended to address the activity of judging or the propositional contents of such acts. It's in the context of that question that the invocation of the sorts of compound judgment that populate Kant's table of judgments, negative, hypothetical, disjunctive, and modal judgments, makes most visible the inadequacy of the traditional way of thinking about judgment. For it then becomes clear that on the traditional theory, the notion of predication is being asked to do two incompatible jobs. On the one hand, it serves as a structural way of building up new judgeable contents. On the other, it's thought of as a kind of doing that has the significance of endorsing such contents. The collision between these two senses in which predication could be called broadly an operation is clearest when one thinks about judgeable contents appearing as unasserted, unendorsed components of more complex sentences or judgments. The conditional is a paradigm. When I assert if P of A, then P of B, I've not asserted P of A. I've not made that judgment. Have I predicated P of A? Well, if so, then predication does not amount to endorsement. Predicating is not judging. But if not, then it looks as though there's an equivocation when I detach from the conditional, reasoning if P of A, then P of B, but P of A, so P of B. For the second premise is a predication, and the antecedent of the first premise is not a predication. Closer to our own time, Geach picks up this Kant-Frege point, using it in his masterful gem-like essay, Ascriptivism, to argue against emotivist semantic analyses of terms of moral evaluation. His target is theories that understand the normative significance of terms such as good, not as part of the content of what's said about an act, not as specifying a characteristic that's being attributed, but rather as marking the pragmatic force of the speech act. Calling something good is thought of as doing something distinctive, say, commending. Geach first asks what the limits of this ploy are. He points to the lovely archaic English verb to macarize, which means to characterize someone as happy. Does the possibility of understanding calling someone happy as macarizing her mean that happiness is not a property being invoked in specifying the content of the claim that someone is happy, because in saying that we're really doing something else, namely performing the special speech act of macarizing? But if we can do that with happy, why not with mass or red? What, Geach wants to know, are the rules of this game? He then suggests the embedding test. Look to see if an expression can be used to construct a judgeable content that's not directly used to perform a speech act, paradigmatically when it serves as the antecedent of a conditional. So for instance, because imperatival force is grammatically marked, we can't say things like, if shut the door, then something. But, by contrast, we can say things like, if he's happy, then I'm glad. And if that's a good thing to do, then you have reason to do it. In the first of these, I have not macarized anyone, and in the second, I have not commended any action. So, the terms good and happy contribute to the specification of the content and are not to be understood merely as force indicators. I call this essay masterful and gem-like. Geach exhibits a deep fault line in an entire philosophical approach, nails down his point, and leaves it at that. The essay is 5 pages long. And, as we know, ushered in the second phase, contemporary expressivism, people like Gibbard and Blackburn, who start with the need to answer this Geach point. Worrying about compound forms of judgment containing unendorsed judgeable contents as components required Kant to distinguish the operations by which such contents are constructed from the activity of endorsing the result of those operations. Further, once we see that the doctrine of judgment as predication is trying to have things both ways, and that no single operation can be taken both to form the contents and to be the adoption of an attitude toward those contents, the need to deal with compound judgments shows that predication is inadequate for both purposes. Endorsing hypothetical, that is, conditional judgeable contents is not happily thought of as predicating, and those contents are not happily thought of as formed by predication. So for this reason, Kant could not take over the traditional classificatory theory of consciousness, which depends on understanding judging as predicating. But what can go in its place? Here is perhaps Kant's deepest and most original idea, the axis around which I see all of his thought as revolving. What distinguishes judging and intentional doing from the activities of non-sapient creatures is not that they involve some special sort of mental processes, but that they're things that knowers and agents are in a distinctive sense responsible for. Judging and acting involve commitments. They're endorsements. They're exercises of authority. Now, responsibility, commitment, endorsement, authority, these are all normative notions. Judgments and actions, Kant thought, make knowers and agents liable to characteristic kinds of normative assessment. His most basic idea is that minded creatures are to be distinguished from unminded ones, not by some matter-of-factual ontological distinction, say the presence of mind stuff, but by a normative deontological one. This is his normative characterization of the mental. Drawing on a jurisprudential tradition that includes Grotius, Pufendorf, and Crucius, Kant talks about norms in the form of rules. Judging and acting, endorsing claims and practical maxims, committing ourselves as to what is or shall be true, is binding ourselves by norms. It's making ourselves subject to assessment according to rules that articulate the contents of those commitments. Those norms, those rules, he calls concepts. In a strict sense, all a Kantian subject can do is apply concepts, either theoretically in judging or practically in acting. Discursive, that is to say concept-mongering creatures, are normative creatures. creatures who live and move and have their being in a normative space. It follows that the most urgent philosophical task is to understand the nature of this normativity, the bindingness or validity, Kant says Verbindlichkeit, Gültigkeit, of conceptual norms. For Descartes, the question was how to think about our grip on concepts, thoughts, or ideas. Is it clear? Is it distinct? For Kant, the question is rather how to understand their grip on us, the conditions of the intelligibility of our being bound by conceptual norms. This master idea has some of Kant's most characteristic innovations as relatively immediate consequences. The logical tradition that understood judging as predicating did so as part of an order of semantic explanation that starts with concepts or terms, particular and general, advances on that basis to an understanding of judgments, now we should say judgeables, as applications of general to particular terms, and builds on that basis an account of inferences or consequences, construed syllogistically in terms of the sort of predication or classification exhibited by the judgments that appear as premises and conclusions. Again, in a radical break with this tradition, Kant takes the whole judgment to be the conceptually and explanatorily basic unit, at once of meaning, cognition, awareness, and experience. Concepts and their contents are to be understood only in terms of the contribution they make to judgments. Concepts, he says, are functions of judgment. Why? I think Kant adopts this order of semantic explanation because judgments are the minimal units of responsibility, the smallest semantic items that can express commitments. The semantic primacy of the propositional is a consequence of the central role that he accords the normative significance of our conceptually articulated doings. Later on in Frege, this thought shows up as the claim that judgeable contents are the smallest units to which pragmatic force can attach, paradigmatically assertional force. And in the later Wittgenstein, it shows up as the claim that sentences are the smallest linguistic unit with which one can make a move in the language game. Understanding judging in normative terms as undertaking a distinctive kind of responsibility is also responsible for the most general features of Kant's account of the form of judgment. The subjective form of judgment, he says, is the I think that can accompany all our judgings, and so in its pure formality is the emptiest of all representations. Thought of in terms of the normative pragmatics of judgment, it's the mark of who is responsible for the judgment. It indicates the relation of the judging to the original synthetic unity of apperception to which it belongs. I'll say something more soon about the use Kant makes of this central concept. But the idea behind it is that the sorting of endorsements into co-responsibility classes is a basic condition of the normative significance of commitments. Committing myself to the animal being a fox, or to driving you to the airport tomorrow morning, normatively preclude me from committing myself to its being a rabbit, or to my sleeping in tomorrow. But they don't in the same way constrain the commitments that others might undertake. The objective form of the judgment is the object equals X, to which judgments always, by their very form as judgments, make implicit reference. Thought of in terms of the normative pragmatics of judgment, it's the mark of what one has made oneself responsible to by making a judgment. It expresses the objectivity of judgments in the sense of having intentional objects, what they purport to represent. The understanding of the intentional directedness of judgments, the fact that they're about something, is through and through a normative one. What the judgment is about is the object that determines the correctness of the commitment one has undertaken by endorsing it. In endorsing a judgment, one has made oneself liable to distinctive kinds of normative assessment, and what one is talking or thinking about is what plays a special role, exercises a special kind of authority in such assessments. Representing something, talking about or thinking of it, is acknowledging its semantic authority over the correctness of the commitments one is making in judging. Representational purport is a normative phenomenon, and representational content is to be understood in terms of it. Now, besides who's responsible for a judging and what the judging is responsible to, there are two other elements that a normative pragmatics of judgment should address. What is it that one makes oneself responsible for by judging? And what is it that one is doing in making oneself responsible, committing oneself, endorsing something? The first is a question as to how to understand judgeable contents. The second is a challenge to fill in the bare-bones picture of judging as a normative doing. The alteration of one's normative status, the undertaking of some sort of responsibility. This is really the key issue, for it's in terms of the answer to this question that we'll have to understand both dimensions of content, what one makes oneself responsible for in judging, and what one makes oneself responsible to, as well as the nature of the subject of those responsibilities. Here, I think, we get Kant's next big idea. Now, let me say, I'm making a lot of claims about sort of what are the important Kantian ideas. There's a lot of ones that I'm not going to be mentioning, though I'm not going to give you text for a lot of these things. The justification is going to be the overall sense that I can make out of them. This is not because I don't feel myself responsible to the actual text. When I'm making these claims about Kant says this is Kant's big idea, I think of myself as having Kant sitting right over my shoulder, shaking his head sometimes, nodding sometimes, anyway, holding my feet to the textual fire about his thought. If you concentrate, maybe you can get that same sense of him sitting over my shoulder and sitting in judgment. I just want to have that image there as I make these various claims. This next big idea is that the responsibility one undertakes in judging is generically a kind of task responsibility. It's the responsibility to do something. Specifically, it's the responsibility to integrate the judgment into a unity of apperception. Synthesizing a unity of apperception is the activity that provides the background and the context in which episodes can have the significance of judgings. Engaging in that activity produces, sustains, and develops a synthetic unity of apperception, a self or subject. So we can ask, what must one do to be doing that? One must integrate new endorsements into the whole that comprises one's previous endorsements. This synthesis by successive integration can be thought of as involving three different sorts of activity: critical, ampliative, and justificatory. One's critical responsibility is to weed out materially incompatible commitments. This means rejecting candidate judgments that are incompatible with what one's already committed to and responsible for, or relinquishing the prior commitments. Judgers, as such, are obliged to renounce commitments to contents that are incompatible with their other commitments, or which have such commitments as their consequences. For, if two commitments are incompatible, each serves as a reason to give up the other. One's ampliative responsibility is to extract the material inferential consequences of each commitment, including the new ones, in the context of the auxiliary hypotheses and collateral premises provided by the rest of one's commitments. Each commitment gives one reason to accept others, which one ought to accept in the sense that one has already implicitly committed oneself to them by acknowledging the commitment from which they follow. One's justificatory responsibility is to be prepared to offer reasons for the commitments, both theoretical and practical, that one acknowledges by citing prior commitments or undertaking further commitments that inferentially entitle one to those new commitments. Seeking to fulfill the first sort of responsibility, the critical one, is aiming at a whole constellation of commitments that's consistent. Seeking to fulfill the second, ampliative one, is aiming at one that's complete. And seeking to fulfill the third is aiming at a constellation of commitments that's warranted. What's produced, sustained, and developed by practically acknowledging these critical, ampliative, and justificatory integrative task responsibilities is a unity precisely in the sense of being governed by, subject to assessment according to, those norms of integration. It's a synthetic unity in that it's produced by the activity of synthesis that is integrating disparate commitments into such a unity. And it's an original synthetic unity of apperception, because what makes an act or episode a judging in the first place is just its being subject to the normative demand that it be integrated into this kind of systematically unified whole. And awareness in the sense of apperception, a matter of sapience, not of mere sentience, is judgment. Apperceiving is judging. Kant also, tellingly, calls the product of this synthetic activity a transcendental unity of apperception. It's transcendental in that it's that in terms of which we must understand the relation to objects, representation, which is an essential dimension of the content of judgments. The key to Kant's account of representation, I'm going to claim, is to be found in the story about how representational purport is to be understood in terms of the activity of synthesizing an original unity of apperception, as I've described it so far. It'll help to approach that story in stages. So far, I've attributed to Kant two positive moves in response to his principled rejection of traditional accounts of judgment as predication. First, understanding the activity of judging in normative terms as the undertaking of a kind of responsibility or commitment. And second, understanding that kind of responsibility as a task responsibility, a commitment to do something, namely to integrate the judgeable content one endorses into a synthetic unity of apperception. In light of the justificatory, ampliative, and critical dimensions of the practical synthetic integrative responsibility, another way of putting this last point is that what one is responsible for is having reasons for one's endorsements, using the contents one endorses as reasons for and against the endorsement of other contents, and taking into account possible countervailing reasons. And that's to say that as normative creatures, we're rational creatures. Not in the sense that we always or even generally think or act as we have reason to do, or that we usually have good reasons for thinking or doing what we do, but in the sense that whether we do or not, we're always liable to normative assessment concerning the goodness of our reasons for thinking as we do or doing what we do. However sensitive we are in fact on any particular occasion to the normative force of the better reason, that peculiar force, at once compulsory yet not always compelling, that so fascinated and puzzled the ancient Greek philosophers, however sensitive we are to that force of the better reason, we are the kind of creatures we are, knowers and agents, creatures whose world is structured by the commitments we undertake, only because we're always liable to normative assessment of our reasons. The norms that articulate the contents of judgments are concepts. The conceptual faculty, the understanding, is the faculty of judgment. Concepts articulate the contents of judgments by determining what one would make oneself responsible for, what one would be committing oneself to, were one to endorse those contents. Kant thinks of concepts as a kind of rule. But what are they rules for doing? Well, they're rules for synthesizing a unity of apperception. And that is to say that they're rules articulating what's a reason for what. The concepts being applied determine what follows from a given claimable, and hence what else one would have committed oneself to or made oneself responsible for by endorsing it. They determine what counts as rational evidence for or against, or justification of a judgeable content, hence what would count as a reason for or against endorsing it. The task of integrating a judgment, or for that matter a practical maxim, into a synthetic unity of apperception has determinate conditions of success and failure only insofar as the judgments have contents that stand to one another in relations of material, consequence, and incompatibility. A knower can have a determinate critical integrative task responsibility only if it's settled which judgeable contents are materially incompatible with which others, so that endorsing some provides good reasons to reject others. And a knower can have a determinate ampliative or justificatory integrative task responsibility only if it's settled which judgments inferentially commit or entitle one to which others, and so provide good reasons for accepting those further judgments. The concepts applied in judging articulate the content of the judgment, the judgeable content that one becomes responsible for, by specifying the material, inferential, and incompatibility relations that content stands in to other contents. For that's what settles what one is responsible for doing in making the judgment. Conceptual content in that sense provides the details of the synthetic integrative responsibility that one is undertaking thereby. Here, the paired notions of a judgeable content and of being responsible for such a content, in the sense of endorsing or committing oneself to it, are being made sense of in terms of a basic kind of task responsibility, being responsible for doing something, namely integrating the judgment into a normative unity of apperception. So, Kant's ideas about the act or activity of judging settle how he must understand the content judged. In conditioning the semantic account of content on the pragmatic account of force, in Frege's sense, that is, the way the story about what's endorsed is shaped by the story about what endorsing is, Kant exhibits a kind of methodological pragmatism. In this sense, that pragmatism does not consist in the explanatory privileging of practical discursive activity over theoretical discursive activity, but rather in the explanatory privileging of act over content within both the theoretical and the practical domains. Kant's explanatory privileging of the activity of synthesizing a unity of apperception would reverberate throughout subsequent German idealism and be embraced and exploited in particular by Fichte and by Hegel. And though I won't say anything about this, this is obviously the origin of the explicit notion of systematicity that comes to be important, maybe too important, in that tradition. The argumentative and explanatory structure that I've been indicating as guiding and working out in a pragmatist spirit Kant's master idea of the fundamentally normative character of judging is a way of thinking about the relation between four things. First, what one must do in order in the relevant sense to be taking responsibility for or committing oneself to a judgeable content or practical maxim. This is the activity of synthesizing an original unity of apperception by integrating the content in question into the whole that comprises all of one's commitments in the light of the relations of material inferential consequence and incompatibility that they stand into one another. Second, what one creates, sustains, and develops by doing that, the constellation of commitments that is an original synthetic unity of apperception. Third, the elements of that synthetic unity, what one takes responsibility for or commits oneself to. These are the judgeable contents that are integrated into the original synthetic unity. And fourth, what one thereby makes oneself responsible to. These are the objects that one comes to represent in the sense of making oneself answerable for the correctness of the endorsed judgeable contents that make up the original synthetic unity. What one makes oneself answerable to. Objects which in that normative sense one thereby counts as thinking, talking, or judging about. It's because of this dimension of conceptual contentfulness that the synthetic unity of apperception deserves to count as a transcendental unity of apperception. For in Kant's usage, transcendental logic differs from general logic in addressing the contents as well as the form of judgments, in the sense of its representation of, or reference, in the sense of normative answerability to, objects. This list of 4 items amounts to an order of explanation. The strategy, I think, is to make sense of each of those elements in terms of those that precede it. Because the kind of normative unity distinctive of the synthetic unity of apperception must be understood in terms of the synthetic integrative activity that produces it, the cognitive practical subject or self that's identified with the synthetic unity of apperception is not happily thought of using the traditional category of substance. It's the moving, living constellation of its affections, that is, of the concomitant commitments that compose and articulate it. The significance of each of the component commitments that contingently and temporarily are included in a particular synthetic unity of apperception depends holistically on its rational, consequential, and incompatibility relations to its fellows. This reciprocal dependence of the whole and its parts, together with the dynamic character of such relational structures as sustained by rational synthetic integrative activity, made it irresistible for subsequent idealists, following Kant himself in his critique of judgment, to appeal to and apply organic metaphors. The two-sided notion of conceptual content that I adverted to on the last 2 items of the list, what one makes oneself responsible for and what one makes oneself responsible to by judging, is also to be explained in terms of the original synthetic activity of integrating one's commitments according to their rational relations to one another. I've claimed that we can think of this as a pragmatist explanatory strategy, in the sense that we find in contemporary philosophers of language who want to understand the meanings expressed by various locutions in terms of the use of those expressions. That is, in suitably broad senses of the terms, to give explanatory priority to pragmatics over semantics. But I've so far said nothing at all about the relations between the two dimensions of conceptual content that show up as the third and fourth items on the list. I've suggested that the target notion of representational purport should itself be understood as a normative meta-concept, as a matter of taking or treating one's commitments as subject to a distinctive kind of authority, as being responsible for its correctness in a characteristic sense to things that in that normative sense count as represented by those representing states, which are what must be integrated into an original synthetic unity. What remains to be seen is how that rational synthetic integrative activity can be understood as instituting a specifically representational normative dimension of authority and responsibility. That's what's required to justify the claim that the original synthetic unity of apperception, as so far described, also deserves to be thought of as a transcendental unity of apperception, the subject studied by transcendental logic, which goes beyond general logic precisely in its concern not just with the form of judgments, but with their content, in particular their representational content. Intentionality, semantic contentfulness, comes in two flavors, what we could call of intentionality and that intentionality. The first, or representational dimension, is semantic directedness at objects, what one is thinking of or talking about. The second, or expressive dimension, concerns the content of our thought and talk, what one is thinking or saying about what one is thinking or talking about. So one can think of or about foxes that they are nocturnal omnivores. What falls within the scope of the of in such a declaration, in such a specification, is a term. But what follows the that in such phrases as I think or John thinks, that foxes are nocturnal omnivores, is a declarative sentence. The pre-Kantian early modern philosophical tradition took it for granted that one ought first to offer an independent account of representational of intentionality, of what it is to represent something, and only then on that basis to explain expressive that intentionality, what it is to judge or claim that things are thus and so. The fact that Kant's approach to judging appeals to the integration of judgments by synthesizing them into a whole according to their rational relations to one another brings into view, in the first instance, a notion of the content a declarative sentence expresses, what one has thereby become responsible for. That is, understood in terms of the broadly inferential relations of inclusion and exclusion that it stands into other contents. But for what thereby becomes visible to be intelligible as a notion of conceptual content, it must also exhibit a representational dimension. Thinking about something is not a special kind of thinking. It's an aspect of all thinking. So the question is how reference to or representation of objects, representational of intentionality, can be made intelligible or shown somehow to be a necessary substructure of inferential that intentionality, when the latter is understood in terms of the rational synthetic integrative activity that is judging. Here's how I think that story goes. The relations of material incompatibility and inferential consequence among judgeable contents that we've seen are a necessary condition of synthesizing a rational unity of apperception, which is to say judging, already implicitly involve commitments concerning the identity and individuation of objects that they can accordingly be understood as representing or being about. Why? The judgment that A is a dog is not incompatible with the judgment that B is a fox. The judgment that A is a dog is incompatible with the judgment that A is a fox. And that means that taking a dog judgment to be materially incompatible with a fox judgment is taking them to refer to or represent an object, the same object. And the same thing holds for relations of material inferential consequence. Taking it that A is a dog does not entail that B is a mammal, but taking it that A is a dog does entail that A is a mammal. So drawing the inference from the dog judgment to the mammal judgment is taking it that the two judgments refer to one and the same object. This triangulation, by acknowledging material incompatibilities and inferences, is, in a nutshell, how the normative demand for a rational unity of apperception, judgments, makes intelligible representational purport, what it is to take or treat judgments as representing, being of or about, objects. It shows how the representational dimension of conceptual content can be understood as already implicit in its articulation by relations of inference and incompatibility, which is how we understood the expressive, or that dimension of intentionality. It provides a sense in which making oneself rationally responsible for an inferentially articulated judgeable content, in the sense of being committed to integrating it into a rational unity of apperception, involves taking or treating those judgments as about objects, and so as making oneself responsible to them. It puts us in a position to understand Kant's otherwise dark claim that it's the unity of consciousness that alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, and thereby their objective validity. End of the quote. Represented objects show up as something like units of account for their inferential and incompatibility relation, for the inferential and incompatibility relations that judgeable contents stand in to one another. If two properties are incompatible, then it's impossible for one and the same object to exhibit both, but not impossible for two different objects to do so. And if possession of one property entails possession of another, then any object that exhibits the first will necessarily exhibit the second, but it's not necessary that some other object do so. Here then is an answer to the question with which we began. What is it for something so much as to seem to be a representation, a representing of something represented? What does one have to do in order to count as taking or treating it as a representing of something? The answer is that treating it as standing in relations of material incompatibility and inferential consequence to other such takings is taking or treating it as a representation, as being about something. This decidedly non-atomistic way of thinking about representational purport is recognizably a way of picking up Descartes' idea, endorsed and developed by Spinoza and Leibniz, that horizontal relations among representings are what's needed to make intelligible this vertical relations between them and representeds. The account of what one must do in order to synthesize a unity of apperception provides the context in which it's possible to understand both dimensions of conceptual content, the inferential expressive and the referential representational. In order to be able to integrate a judgeable content into a unity of apperception, we've seen, one has to be able to distinguish in practice what follows from it and what would be evidence for it, and what's incompatible with it. But now we could introduce a new kind of claim, if P then Q. For instance, though we could do it otherwise, according to the rules, one is committed to if P then Q if and only if one takes it that the material inference from P to Q is a good one, and the inference from if P then Q and R to Q, just in case the material inference from R to P is good, and if P then Q is incompatible with R, just in case the material inference from R to P is good, and there's some S incompatible with Q, such that the material inference from R to S is good. Those amount to rules for forming hypothetical judgments. They specify the conceptual contents of such judgments, for they associate a definite set of material, inferential, and incompatibility relations with each such judgment. And those relations are what settle what counts as successfully integrating such judgments into a synthetic unity of apperception. But that means that anybody who can integrate any non-hypothetical judgments into a synthetic unity of apperception already knows how to do everything in principle needed to integrate hypothetical judgments involving those same judgeable contents into a synthetic unity. In a similar way, it's possible to use the practical mastery of the notion of material incompatibility exhibited by anyone capable of engaging in the basic synthetic integrative activity to introduce explicit notions of negation and necessity. The idea being that one is committed to necessarily not P and Q whenever one treats P and Q as materially incompatible. Now, a concept, on Kant's usage, is a rule for forming a judgment. In this sense, forming a judgment is settling what counts as successfully integrating it into a synthetic unity of apperception. The concepts according to which hypothetical, modal, and negative judgments are formed, then, are a priori, in the sense that any subject of apperception, which is to say that any subject that can engage in judging, and hence be aware of anything in the sense of sapient or apperceptive awareness, at least implicitly always already possesses and can deploy those concepts. They are in this sense pure concepts, what Kant calls categories, and each is associated with a form of judgment. In these cases, they're associated with forms of compound judgment. The very kind of judgment, recall, consideration of which turned out to require a new theory, both of the activity of judging and of the contents judged. In the case of the hypothetical, Kant thinks the category is that of causation, in the sense of one thing necessitating another. Thereon hangs a tale. The only conclusion I want to draw from this line of thought at this point is that here we have an example of at least some of Kant's central categories that we can understand entirely in terms of the process of synthesizing a synthetic unity of apperception. And notice that in this way of telling the story, we did not at all have to presuppose the possibility of something called synthetic knowledge a priori and then search for the conditions of its possibility. What we have had to presuppose in telling this story about the activity of synthesizing a transcendental unity of apperception is the availability as raw materials of judgeable or practically endorsable items that possess determinate conceptual contents. That is, it must already be settled at each stage of the process of rational, critical, and ampliative integration what relations of material incompatibility and inferential consequence the conceptual contents that are to be integrated stand into one another. In order to assess the status of that presupposition concerning conceptual contents, we need to look more closely at the kind of normative force that's involved in taking responsibility for the use of concepts in judgment and intentional action. That's the topic of my next lecture. I pointed out a minute ago that when we understand represented objects, what one makes oneself responsible to in becoming responsible for a judgeable content by judging, integrating it into a synthetic unity of apperception, when we understand that in terms of triangulation of the material incompatibility and inferential consequence relations that articulate the contents of those judgeable contents, those objects show up as something like units of account for properties, which stand in those relations of exclusion and inclusion or consequence. Hegel will talk about Ausschließen and Schließen. Representing subjects, understood as original synthetic unities of apperception, can also be understood as something like units of account for commitments, or judgings, and in the extended system, also endorsements of practical maxims. Subjects are something like units of account for commitments which stand in relations of exclusion and consequence to one another. Subjects and objects are alike in, as Hegel will say, repelling material incompatibilities and encompassing material consequences. They're different in that while it's impossible for one and the same object at the same time to exhibit two incompatible properties, and necessary that it have all the properties entailed by any properties it does have, it's merely inappropriate for one and the same subject at the same time to undertake incompatible commitments, and obligatory that it acknowledge all the commitments entailed by commitments it does acknowledge. In the case of objects, the relations of exclusion and inclusion that define them are alethic modal ones, a matter of what is and is not possible and is not necessary. In the case of subjects, the relations of exclusion and inclusion are deontic or normative ones, a matter of what one is or is not entitled and committed to or responsible for, hence of liability to normative assessment and criticism. That is, objects play the conceptual role of units of account for alethic modal incompatibilities. A single object just is what cannot have incompatible properties at the same time. That is, it's an essential individuating feature of the metaphysical, categorical, sortal metaconcept object, that objects have the meta-property of modally repelling incompatibilities. And in a parallel fashion, subjects too are individuated by the way they normatively repel incompatible commitments. It's not impermissible for two different subjects to have incompatible commitments. Say, for me to take the coin to be copper and you to take it to be an electrical insulator. What is impermissible is for one and the same subject to do so. Subjects play the conceptual role of units of account for deontic normative incompatibilities. That is, it's an essential individuating feature of the metaphysical, categorical, sortal metaconcept subject that subjects have the meta-property of normatively repelling incompatibilities. A subject just is what ought not to have incompatible commitments at the same time. When Hegel looks back at Kant's account of the nature of the subject, and I'm starting in on the parts of my lectures, mostly the next two, where I'll be talking about Hegel, so you ought once again to be visualizing the man there thinking this. When Hegel looks back at Kant's account of the nature of the subject, construed as an original unity of apperception, and marked by the subjective form of all judgments, the I think, and of the objects to which subjects make themselves responsible in judging, marked by the objective form of judgments, the object equals X, it strikes him that both are to be understood in terms of the synthetic integrative activity of integrating judgments with one another by critical exclusion and ampliative inclusion or exclusion. That sort of doing is what makes the concepts of both subject and object intelligible as what's responsible for judgments and what they are responsible to. The idea that's what's expressed on the objective side by alethic modal relations and on the subjective side by deontic normative relations, the idea that that is the key to understanding the intentional relations between subject and object, that I claim is the key idea of idealism, the idea that joins Kant and Hegel. It's certainly one of the core ideas around which Hegel elaborates his idealism. Consciousness, in the sense of apperception, a relation between subjects and objects, presupposes and is to be understood in terms of the process of synthesizing a self, the process that is self-consciousness. What now show up as symmetric subjective and objective poles of consciousness, the intentional nexus, are to be understood as corresponding to two aspects of the activity of synthesizing a unity of apperception that can, in the way I've rehearsed, be seen to be necessarily a transcendental, that is, an object representing unity. Alethic and deontic modalities, what's expressed by modal and normative vocabulary, show up as two sides of one coin, intimately bound together by the synthetic integrative systematizing activity that is the ultimate source of the senses of both kinds of locution. I'll have more to say about this idea and the demarcation of the normative in my next lecture, which centers on practical rather than theoretical philosophy. Its title is Autonomy, Community, and Freedom.